Hey y'all, my name is Jessica Pingwild and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be the start of a new series here on my channel. I'm not 100% sold on a name, so if you have any ideas, leave them in the comments below. But essentially, it's going to be an evaluation of disability representation in mainstream media. If you're at all familiar with my content over on Instagram or on my blog or even here on YouTube, you know how much I value disability representation. Positive and authentic representation can truly change the world for any marginalized group. You might be thinking to yourself, wouldn't it matter more if you focused on disability rights and actually making legislation and doing the activism at the core to make things better? Of course, those things are incredibly important, but I view it as a trickle-down effect. So when it comes to representation, if your face, if your body, if your story, if your authentic self is represented in the media, then slowly but surely people in society will get used to your being present and therefore care more about your issues, and therefore change will happen. Positive and authentic representation has done so much for so many different marginalized groups already. The LGBTQ community is the first one that comes to mind. Is their representation perfect? Absolutely not. But has their representation continued to improve over the last 2 decades? 100% yes. And look what's happened. Marriage equality, civil protections, a willingness to have tough conversations surrounding gender, identity, and sexuality. And of course, most importantly, a more widespread acceptance of the LGBTQ+ community. When it comes to disability, I truly believe that representation is the step forward. I believe it is our way into the future, and it is our way to establish that we deserve equal rights. Equity is a powerful thing, but many people see, especially in the United States, that the ADA is in place, and so don't disabled people already have equal rights? Not even close. And the best way to show that is in mainstream media, whether that be through journalism, movies, television, magazines, books, you name it. There's so many different ways that the disabled community can show up and be seen. So many opportunities that we're not currently being given. Last year, I had the honor of being a guest on one of my favorite podcasts, Shouting About the Silence. The host, Madison Cohen, had found this really great statistic about what it would take for disability to be properly represented in the media. The statistic says that for every 5 characters, 1 should be disabled. Are your favorite TV shows hitting that mark? What about movies? What was the last book that you read that featured a disabled character? Disability can look like so many different things. It can look like a chronic illness. It can look like a mental illness. It can look like me in a wheelchair. It can look like a cancer patient. There are so many different ways that you can define disability. But it needs to be present. We need to show that the human body is flawed in a lot of ways, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the human themselves are flawed. Generally, those two things are tied together in the media, and it's time we put an end to it, because until we get rid of that stereotype, until we rid society completely of that mentality, then people with disabilities are going to constantly be looked down upon, passed over for opportunities, and overall just not given the equality and equity that we deserve. Now, I'm not saying that positive and authentic representation can fix everything. I'm not saying that it's going to be the Band-Aid to cover up all of those experiences, and I'm definitely not saying that all of society will react well to us being included in the media. But it is a great place to start, as it will give us that exposure that we need to share our stories and ultimately normalize not just our bodies, but our experiences. So with all that said, today's video is going to focus on one of my all-time favorite shows. I'm a huge fan of the Bachelor franchise. Since I think sophomore year in high school, I've watched every single season of this show. And with that in mind, I want to take some time today to evaluate this most recent season of The Bachelor, because they did something they've never done before, and they cast a deaf contestant to be on the show. Now, this season was already a representation home run compared to a lot of their other seasons. The Bachelor franchise has never cast a person of color as the male lead on The Bachelor before. It was a first, and it was a step in the right direction. So when I found out that they cast a deaf person to be on the show, I was truly astounded. For a show that mainstream to really branch out in terms of its diversity is honestly a huge deal. The Bachelor is one of the most watched shows in America every single year. Even if people don't like the show, they keep coming back for more because one, it's very big in pop culture, so in order to kind of stay on top of conversations, you kind of have to indulge. And two, honestly, the drama is really intoxicating. And three, you have people like me who actually enjoy watching the love stories unfold, even if they aren't necessarily perfect or completely real all the time. It's a great mindless show, it's a great community building show, and it's honestly just a really nice way to grab a glass of wine and unwind at the end of a busy Monday night. But anyway, back to the matter at hand. Abigail Herringer, I hope I said her name right. Abigail Herringer was the first deaf contestant to be cast on The Bachelor. She's stunning, she has such a fun personality, and honestly, I was rooting for her the entire show. But to give this video a little bit more structure, I am going to talk about 3 main events that featured Abigail throughout this season and talk about whether or not in total, they led to positive, authentic representation of disability and specifically the deaf community on the show. So if you're new to my channel, I do want to just put a clarification out there that I myself am not deaf and cannot give the best 100% evaluation of this season. I can only give my perspective as a disability advocate and the general wider disability community to show whether or not I believe that for that very big community, if this was positive and authentic representation. I cannot speak for the deaf community and I'm not going to try to. So now that that warning is out there, I think I can begin. And to start, I'm actually going to truly start at the beginning, which was the first night of the show when all of the girls get to meet the Bachelor for the first time. In this case, the Bachelor's name was Matt James. He is very attractive, very nice, a little bland, not gonna lie, but he was our Bachelor. He is who all the girls are meeting. And that is where Abigail's story begins, obviously. But it begins here for a very specific reason. You see, Abigail was gifted the first impression rose on that first night. This is a very coveted position to be in. Because one, it means that you stood out enough amongst like 30 women to get that affirmation, to get that affection, and ultimately get that safety net going into that first rose ceremony. And secondly, most of the women or men on The Bachelorette who get that first impression rose usually end up at least going to hometowns. Now that's not a hard and fast rule, but that does show how important that first connection is, how important that first night is. And Abigail won it. She got that first impression rose off of Matt. And I look back on that first night and their flirty conversation and their just general connection was definitely there. But I remember finding it very suspicious and a little strange that she got the first impression rose. Now don't come for me yet, let me explain. Especially when we look ahead to the rest of the season, her getting the first impression rose is a little confusing. Because generally, if you get that first impression rose, as I said, you are top of mind for not just that night, but leading into the future of your relationship with the lead. Abigail never got a one-on-one date, meaning she never got any really quality time with Matt. So if Matt didn't want to give her that quality time, why did he give her the first impression rose? I've truly just never seen that before. Generally, when a contestant gets that first impression rose, they're on a one-on-one date the next week. Or sometimes maybe not that first week, but the second week. Definitely, you're not waiting longer than the 3rd week for that one-on-one if you got that first impression rose, which boggles my mind. It does make me question the authenticity of that gift of that first impression rose. And I truly hate to put this into words, but I have to for the sake of being honest and transparent in this video. But there has been a part of me that has wondered if maybe the producers told Matt to give Abigail that first impression rose. She's the deaf girl, she's the disabled girl. Give her the first impression rose, whether it be for views, whether it be to show that they are really open to representation. I don't know, but it did feel like that could be part of it. I'm not gonna lie. All of that said, I don't want to take away from the connection that Matt and Abigail had because I do believe that that was real. Even though it didn't progress very far, there was chemistry between them, and that was obvious from that first conversation. So I can't speak to the intent, behind Matt James's choice to give her the first impression rose. I can only evaluate it as a viewer who is familiar with disability and how it is often portrayed on screen, and look at it very critically from that lens. But like I said, it could have been completely genuine. It could have been all his decision, and he could have had the best intentions moving forward. Maybe he really genuinely wanted to go on a one-on-one with her, and it just never timed out. Like, maybe it just, for some reason, other relationships started to blossom further, and he kind of, I don't want to say forgot about Abigail, but she just kind of got left in the dust. And if that's the case, that's great. But I also know that in order to make this video to the best of my ability, I need to bring up the potential that maybe everything wasn't what it seemed. All right, we are going to move on to the second event that is really important in this evaluation, and that is Abigail's very deep and very vulnerable conversation about having children in the future with Matt if she ends up being in that final engagement position. Now, in real life, if you've only been dating somebody for a month, it's probably pretty abnormal to talk about family life and what life is going to look like long into the future that early, right? Of course. But The Bachelor and pretty much every dating show out on the market is not normal dating life. It's a completely different and a hyper-intensive experience. And so talking about families that early on is not just normal, it's kind of honestly a necessity to be on the show. Like, many contestants have been thrown off because they were unwilling to have those deep and tough conversations within the first month of dating. So in Abigail's interviews, when she started talking about needing to discuss something pretty intimate with Matt, it was not surprising. Long story short, to sum up what she said, Abigail basically let Matt know that if things were to progress between them, if they were to get engaged, get married, and want to start a family, she let him know that there was a pretty good chance that her future children would also be deaf. It was so vulnerable and so intensive, and it reminds me of a very similar conversation that I've had with my own husband. And if I'm totally honest with you, in all 24 years of my life, I have never seen another disabled person have this conversation on TV. Whether it be reality TV or a scripted show, it doesn't matter. I've never seen it. I've never seen it. This is a very serious moment that many disabled people face in their lifetimes. It's terrifying. I've been there. I had to have this conversation with my husband. I had to let Jack know that, hey, I don't know exactly what's going on with my really rare condition, and I don't know if I can give it to our children in the future, but it's a possibility. Did I do it within the first month? No, but I did do it before we got engaged, and quite honestly, I probably did it earlier in a relationship than somebody who is non-disabled would probably have conversations about family. Because for me, dating was very serious, and if I want to progress to that next step, if I want to pursue this relationship further, I need my partner to know exactly what they're getting themselves into. Not only am I going to have a lot of health issues, but there are strong potentials for our children too as well. And that's a very vulnerable conversation to have when you're not on national TV. The representation that Abigail just gave the disability community and the deaf community specifically with that conversation is, honestly, it's astronomical in how impactful I think it will be for future generations. Now, that might be putting a lot of weight on one conversation, but I'm dead serious. There's truly no telling what that conversation did for the wider community. I'm sure there's people like myself who see that conversation unfolding on my TV and wish that it'd come to me sooner in life. I'm sure there's plenty of people who also feel really validated by that conversation. I know I do. When you're in a relationship with somebody, no matter if you're disabled or non-disabled, you obviously have to be very vulnerable and let people see your insecurities and let them in to your full self. But when you're disabled or chronically ill or mentally ill or whatever, that box gets so much bigger, and all of the vulnerabilities are that much more physical, emotional, everything. And conversations about the future aren't just black and white. It's not just about how many kids you're gonna have and do you want a boy or a girl and what do you want to name them. It's not just that. You have to have these tough conversations. Even if your condition isn't genetic, you still need to talk about how you're going to raise a child or be in a family environment as a disabled person, because that can look so different for all the different types of disabilities out there. So it can really challenge those traditional family values that so many people hold on this pedestal as being the only way to live a successful life. And it's very scary to open the door for that rejection, because when one person rejects you for something like that, it can feel like everybody will. And so for Abigail, not only to bring that conversation to a national platform, but also all of the overwhelm and fear and insecurity behind having tough conversations like that from a disabled perspective, chef's kiss. That is representation at its finest. All right, so the third and final event that I need to discuss with y'all in order to properly evaluate disability representation in this season of The Bachelor is Abigail's appearance on the Women Tell All episode. So once again, if you're unfamiliar with the show, the Women Tell All episode is very special because it brings back all of the contestants who have so far been let go from the season. It is truly reality TV at its finest, and it is a full-on drama fest, but it's very entertaining, and I do think that, especially for the women who get very close to being in that final three, it can be very, very good for them because I feel like it often gives them closure with the lead. So the structure is all of the women kind of discuss all the drama in the house for like the first hour, and then for the second hour, the host brings out specific women who had a really impactful time on the show, interviews them one-on-one, and then for the last like 20 minutes, the lead comes out and is able to have conversations with these women about sometimes why he let them go specifically, but also just in general to reflect on the season, their positive experience. Yeah. So Abigail made it all the way until the week before hometowns. So I think she was in the top 6 or 7, which is pretty good for a show that originally starts with like 30 women. Plus this season, they added another 5 women about halfway through. And then one other girl just showed up in the middle of the season too. So there was a lot of women to compete with. And so for Abigail to get to that position, phenomenal. We love to see it. But something that I really appreciated during this Women Tell All episode was Bachelor Nation's focus on the deaf community. So because Abigail made it so far, and because she got that first impression rose, and because her connection was so strong with Matt throughout the show, she was one of the few that was invited onto the couch with the host, Chris Harrison, to have a one-on-one interview and really explore her time on the show. Of course, you had the traditional stuff. They replayed her little segments from the season. She got emotional. They talked about the romance part of it. But near the end of the conversation, Chris Harrison also brought up the fact that her presence on the show was a huge success amongst the disabled and deaf community. And they went on to have a conversation about why that was. It was brief, but it happened. Basically, they were going through different comments and tweets and ultimately different messages that Abigail had received due to her being on The Bachelor. And many of them were from members of the disability community or allies to the disability community or family members of people with disabilities. Basically telling Abigail that her presence on the show was so important to them because disability is hardly ever shown in a romantic light. We're not seen as optimal partners or love interests. We're not seen as romantic. We're not seen as desirable. We're not seen in that romance space. And so for there to be a deaf person on this show about love that is seen by millions of people, it's, again, I will just use, it's incredibly impactful because it shows that we can be desirable, and there's not just one look to disability, and that disabled people are just as worthy of love and romance as a non-disabled person. It gives us the ability to be seen in that light, and not many shows, reality or scripted, do that. So not only was Abigail's presence on the show already amazing, but to use her interview time to talk about the lack of disability representation in the media was just the icing on the cake. So to quickly sum up everything that I've just said, Though the intention behind the first impression rose is obviously in question, I don't think that the potential for that to have been pushed upon Matt takes away from the positive and authentic representation that Abigail gave by being a part of the show. Reality TV is tough. You want to assume that everything that is going on is authentic and real, but you just know that that's not always the case. When it comes to that first impression rose, we probably will never know. And that's okay, because in the grand scheme of the show, it doesn't matter. She was regarded as a highly competitive figure on this season of The Bachelor, both I think by Matt and by the Bachelor Nation community. Her presence on the show and the impact that she had has left a lot of people asking for her to be named the next Bachelorette, which is amazing. Even if she's not chosen, the fact that people want her to be the next Bachelorette shows how positive this representation was and shows what representation can do if done well. But I think that brings us to the end of this disability representation evaluation. If you liked today's video, please let me know by giving this video a thumbs up. I would love to continue to do this as more disability representation is shown in mainstream media. So it would be very, very beneficial for me to know if you actually enjoyed this new potential series. So seriously, please give it a thumbs up if you liked it so I know. Also, leave me a comment down below about other forms of disability representation in mainstream media that I may not be aware of. I'd love to check them out and also give my evaluation on those in the future as well. While you're already down there, don't forget to hit the subscription button and the notification bell as well. I have a lot of great content coming out in the next few weeks and I cannot wait for you guys to see it all. So I want to make sure that you can see it all and that you get notifications when I post. So be sure to hit those buttons. Finally, be sure to check out the description below to follow me on all of my social media channels. I am at The Rolling Explorer on everything except Twitter, where I'm just at Rolling Explorer. And down in the description, you can also find my blog. It is therollingexplorer.com. There I talk about my life as a person with a disability, as well as disability advocacy, disability education, disability rights, all that good stuff is on my website. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today, and I'll see you next time.